I want to thank Stefan and the Katholische Akademie in Berlin. I want to thank Christian and Christoph because they have suffered multiple versions of this paper being sent rather late in the development of this program. But in a way, this particular talk goes back to a meeting that they co-organized in Hamburg in 2015, and that's the meeting that's represented in the new book that Stefan held up. I realized you couldn't hear what he was saying, but the proceedings of that conference are now out. However, my paper isn't there because I was in England. But actually, there really is another reason. The paper that I have for you tonight, I'm not going to read it, I'm going to talk the way through it, really began with Heiko's paper, who has joined us this evening at that conference, which was also on Royce's Theodicy. And we had an interesting discussion about it. And I realized that if I wanted to make objections to the way that Heiko was going about it, I had better have my own positive story as to how the theodicy really works in Royce. I don't think it actually is a theodicy. And in the long version of the paper, which I'm happy to send to anyone who wants it, it's not quite finished, but it's close enough. In the long version of the paper, I explain why I don't think it's quite right to call it a theodicy. But the fast version of it is that it's not a justification of the ways of God to man, which is that's the old definition of a theodicy, and that's not what Royce is about. So I realize that some of you don't know anything about Royce, so I'm going to make a very sort of fast, sweeping introduction about, well, let's see, how do I change slides here? There we go. All right. So Josiah Royce, 1855, 1916, and what I have listed here is where he lived during these periods of his life. Grass Valley, California is where he was born and spent his first 11 years. That was essentially a mining town, and I'm going to say a little bit more about that further down the line. He finished his growing up process in San Francisco, which was a pretty wild and woolly place, 1866 to 72. Those were the same years, by the way, that Samuel Clemens, known as Mark Twain, was in San Francisco. So in my imagination, they met. I don't know that they did, but I do know that Royce's house was right down the street from Twain's regular bar. So Mark Twain's bar. So in any case, I'm going to write an imagined meeting in some future work. Oakland, he went across the bay and went to the brand new University of California. He was in the first graduating class of the University of California, and it was in Oakland at that time. They moved to Berkeley the year after Royce left. And so he lived in Oakland during those years and got his undergraduate education, after which he came to Leipzig and Göttingen, right, where Christian is professor of theology. At Göttingen, significantly, he studied with Auxier, and this turned out to be a huge influence on him. He became fascinated with Schopenhauer during that same time, but I'm pleased to say that he outgrew it. All right, then he came back from Germany, fluent in German, and he remained so for the rest of his life. That was very important because he kept up with everything that was happening in German philosophy during a time when not a lot of American scholars did. And so he was among the first to read Nietzsche. He kept up with everything. In particular, he was the first person in the United States ever to quote Husserl when Husserl was utterly unknown in Germany. But Royce knew who he was. In his presidential address to the American Psychological Association in 1902, Royce criticized Husserl. So anyway, Boston 1877 was a crucial summer for him. He stayed in Boston in a place that was secured for him by William James, and this was before he returned to California. And during that time, he read, at the same time, Charles Sanders Peirce's anti-Cartesian articles, and he read As They Appeared in the Monist not the Lone Star, the Illustrations of Logic of Science in the Popular Science Monthly, and so those were coming out through that summer. Because Royce read the anti-Cartesian articles 1867, 1868, at the same time that he read the Illustrations of Logic of Science, Royce wrongly believed that it was one philosophy. And he carried that misconception of Peirce's philosophy until about 1892. He thought it was the same thing. Meanwhile, Peirce never saw it that way himself. But it was crucial because in his development, this encounter with Peirce and Peirce's philosophy changed Royce's life. He went back and taught at the University of California, Berkeley, 1877, 1882, and then he got the good luck or good fortune to be called back to Cambridge, Massachusetts, by his friend William James to serve as a sabbatical replacement. And he managed to get that job 2 years in a row, and then they appointed him full time, and he taught at Harvard for the rest of his career. He traveled to Europe many times. He traveled to Australia. He traveled to the South Seas. He traveled to Latin America and the Caribbean. So he was a world traveler and became not just the country bumpkin from California, but he did always carry that country bumpkin sort of mantle with him, even as he became quite a cosmopolitan fellow. Now, here's what everybody misses who writes about Royce. Not a single thing I have ever read on Royce, and I think I've read pretty much everything that's been written, ever mentions that he grew up a Campbellite. Now, the Campbellites don't like being called Campbellites, but it's as good a designation as I can come up with for this theological school. Thomas and Alexander Campbell and Martin Stone formed a religious movement in Western New York State, even though they were from other places. The Campbells were from Scotland, Martin Stone was from Virginia and Maryland, that area. But there were a lot of American new religions that were being formed at this time. After the American Revolution, all kinds of new versions of Christianity were being formed. The Jehovah's Witnesses come from this time. The Mormons come from this time, same place, all Western New York. And Mary Baker Eddy and Christian Science in Boston was being developed at this time. And so there were a lot of these sort of, it's very difficult to describe these American new religions. They were all progressive, but that did not mean that they were not strictly religious. They very much were. And as you know, the Jehovah's Witnesses, particularly, the Seventh-day Adventists also, same place, same time. They were called Millerites then. The Jehovah's Witnesses were called Russellites then because they were founded in Russell. And the Mormons, of course, could have been called Smithians, I suppose, since their founder was Joseph Smith. These American new religions have thrived, but there were many, many more of them than the ones that you've heard of, the ones that I just mentioned. And one of them that you probably haven't heard of, even though it not only survived, it thrived and it's still with us, is the Campbellite movement, the Stone Campbell movement, it's sometimes called. These guys had been Methodists, and at least the Campbells had also been Presbyterians. And they were dissatisfied with what we would now call mainline Protestant theology. And so they reworked it. And this is the basis of it. And this is what Royce grew up with, the Candlelight Theology. It's a rejection of the old Orthodox Presbyterian teaching that Christ died only for the least number. So Christ died for anyone, for these people. So there's a universalism as long as you take the needed steps. Anyone can go to heaven, right? The belief that Christ died for all, that doesn't mean that you automatically get into heaven, but you could. And that any man could believe the gospel and be saved. You don't need the mediation of a preacher. You don't need the mediation of a congregation. All you need is the gospel. Rejection of the Westminster Confession, which was sort of the peace that was made between the Scottish Presbyterians and the Church of England. They wanted nothing to do with that because it prescribed ways of life as well as certain non-biblical and in particular non-New Testament forms of public interaction. And so that was too much of a mix of church and state for the Campbellites. There's a demand for the independence of every local congregation. So the Campbellites have a congregational form of church polity. They ordain their own ministers, and this is done at the level of the congregation. You do not have to go to some formal institution and get some kind of formal education to be a Candlelight minister. However, I wouldn't want you to think that that means these people weren't educated. In fact, they didn't recognize translations of the New Testament as being the genuine gospel. They all read Greek, and they didn't accept it in any other language. And so for the first 100 years or so, the Campbellites pretty much all read Greek. Of course, now they have seminaries, and they don't all read Greek anymore. But it was very, very important to the Campbells and to Stone that people understood that translations of the New Testament are not the true gospel as far as they're concerned. The desire to escape from the limits of sectarianism, which was very, very bad in the United States during this period, the 19th century. Sectarian strife among religious groups was just horrendously bad. They wanted nothing to do with that. They didn't regard themselves as a sect. They didn't regard themselves as a denomination. They called themselves Christians, and that's it. Just Christians. And so we have the Christian church. Now, if you go all over the United States, you'll see First Christian Church, the Christian church on Broadway. That's these guys. And so they split in 1906 because a much more conservative leader among the Campbellites named J. Frank Norris objected to some of the modernization that was going on in the Candlelight group. This is a huge group. This is not a small denomination. It's a very large denomination. And so they split into two groups, mostly north and south. The southern group calls themselves the Church of Christ. The northern group calls themselves the Christian Church. But you can find churches of Christ in the north, and you can find Christian churches in the south. This is Royce's heritage. They are called restorationists. They do not recognize the Old Testament as being a sacred book. They recognize it only as being an incredibly important history. The self-sufficient, and they reject the church as an institution altogether. They don't believe that institutional mediation is needed, and in fact, it's positively pernicious to Christian faith as far as they are concerned. They do not, as so many Protestants do, reconnect at Augustine. They don't. They reject the ecumenical councils. They reject the Catholic Church all the way back. They recognize only the Pauline community. And because Paul's letters are older than the Gospels, they believe in the primacy of Paul. So it's a very interesting religion. It has amazed me in reading all the Royce scholarship that people seem to think that Royce made up the Pauline community in his book, The Problem of Christianity. He didn't. This is what he was raised on. And in fact, his version of it is nothing but a liberal Campbellite version of the Pauline community. So the primacy of Paul was what he was raised with. His most important teacher, so this came from Bible studies, last testament. His most important teacher was his mother, who was a sort of mystical theologian. And she was something else, a force of nature, I think, or maybe a force of something else. And I have to, in order for you to understand Royce's theology, you have to understand his mother's theology. Good news, we have it. It got written down. And so her diary, as they crossed the plains in 1849, they were 49ers, as they crossed the plains, she kept a diary. And she was finally urged to write everything down and put it in order. It was published well after her death by the Yale University Press. And so I'm going to pull, this is a great read. It's an absolutely fantastic read. Royce wasn't born yet. He was going to be born 6 years later. She did have a child on the way across the plains. It was amazing. So they crossed the Continental Divide, which is in Colorado. And Sarah Royce was moved to raise an Ebenezer. Now, this you have to read the book of 1 Samuel to see what this is. But when Samuel finally defeated not Samuel, but Saul did it. It's in the book of Samuel. finally defeated the Philistines once and for all. He made a pile of stones, and this is what it means to raise an Ebenezer. So she wanted to do this, marking the transition, basically from the plains to the west, which is what the continental divide is usually recognized doing. So this is what she said. She wants to raise an Ebenezer. Nobody would notice or understand it. That doesn't bother her, right? But my heavenly Father would see the little monument, little pile of stones, in the mountain wilderness and accept the humble thanks it recorded. So I turned to gather stones, but no stone could I find, not even pebbles enough to make a heap, and no stick either. The continental divide is pretty bare, folks. At least it is at this point, pretty much every point, the western continental divide anyway. So it wasn't anything. A shrub or a tree within reach. So, and here's the crucial thing. I stood still upon a spot until the two wagons and the little company had passed out of hearing. And when I left, not a visible sign marked the space. I want you to think about that. What kind of God and what kind of theologian would raise an Ebenezer in that way? Well, God is both temporal and eternal for these folks. And so, having frozen herself for a moment in silence, it becomes a part of God. God doesn't forget anything. And so therefore, you have it. She raised an Ebenezer. This is Royce's God. All right. So we're going to skip way ahead. The Grand Lectures. These were given in Brooklyn from January to March 1896. And you can see the titles of the 5 lectures there. They have a very interesting history in terms of how they were written, what parts of them were used in other pieces of writing. But the main thing is that of the big pile of lectures, and they're all about 70 to 80 handwritten pages, only a tiny part has ever been published. There was a piece of lecture 3 that was published in a book called The Conception of God, and there was a piece of lecture 5 that was published as The Problem of Job, with a new introduction written for it. The Graham Lectures contain James Joyce's theology, Josiah Royce's theology, and very few people study them. You can actually find them on the Royce edition website, and most of the material has been moved from these pictures of manuscripts into typescripts that you can read. Not all of it is there, but most of it is. In fact, we have pretty much all of the lectures intact, but they haven't been reassembled from the various places where they got divided when Royce's stuff was divided. Okay, now we're to the heart of things. This is the thesis of the Graham Lectures. And it really is, these lectures are, I think, because the problem of Job was taken from them, and because the problem of Job became a very famous essay for Royce, especially in American philosophical theology, it's a landmark essay. But nobody realized that there's this much material. 4.5 other lectures that give the background, because it's the very last part of the very last lecture that got published. And people have not been able to work out how the theological point of view that's developed there fits with Royce's philosophical views. Because he says some things in The Problem of Job that he just doesn't say anywhere else. And in particular, there are a lot of people who like The Problem of Job who have no use for anything else that Royce said. So anyway, this is the thesis. This is a quote. The theses of these lectures, this is the very last page of lecture 1, will be that God is the absolute spirit, and as such, the one reality. That despite this fact, yes, even because of this fact, Ethical monotheism is a true doctrine. That although Aristotle's conception of God was, as far as it went, a true conception, our modern notions of nature will not permit us to use Aristotle's arguments and find, to sum up all in one statement, that God is the only reality, but that his revelation to us is the moral and not the natural order. That negation is incredibly important. It's not the natural order. For the natural order, as we men see it, is a show, a hint, an anticipation of a hidden reality whose foundation we can indeed surmise, so science is not in vain, as I shall try to show you, though we cannot attain thereto. But in the moral world, as we shall see, reason maintained, God and man, as it were, touch hands. Here, then, we shall reach the manifestation of God in his, and, if we choose, in our works. It's nothing but candlelight theology. This is just straightforward. This is what they think. But that does not mean that Royce's theology is straight candlelight theology. So that's the thesis. I'm not going to read all of these, but I am going to give you key passages, which I realize you probably won't have time to read them as I go through, but I'm going to pick out of each of these lectures a key passage. This one is from the first lecture, and the key here and the important point is that the kind of ethical theism that Royce is talking about, it's based on Kant. It's based on the way Kant understood the moral relationship between human beings and the divine. That means the primacy of pure practical reason. It means that the concept of God is a concept of reason, not a concept of nature. And it means that multiple conceptions of God, not concepts, but conceptions of God are reasonable upon the basis of practical reason. Your experience is going to actually help you to decide which conceptions of God are possible for human reason. Human reason then becomes, and reason in Kant's sense of reason, becomes the final arbiter of what counts as an ethical faith. Now, just as with Kant, he limits reason to make room for faith, but he points out that a kind of practical faith is necessary for all philosophy. And so the most important part of this is it turns out that the God of Israel, as taught by the prophets of Israel, is the God that can be defended rationally. The Aristotelian conception of God is, to use his word, theoretically untrustworthy. Now, of course, this is, Kant said as much. This is, if you read the Antinomies, and if you see what he does with the conception of God and religion within the limits of reason alone, you can't miss what Royce is doing. And so this is Kant, except the interesting thing is that Kant really doesn't talk about the prophetic God of Israel as being the primary teacher of the human race. And so the age of the prophets becomes Royce's most important sort of innovation. And this is not Candlelight theology. This is Hermann Cohen. This is a version of Judaic interpretation of Kant that impressed Royce. And as a result, he reconnected with what you might call a modern Judaic reading, which the Candlelights don't have, of the sources, the human sources of ethical monotheism. This really made a very big difference to him, all right? Now, lecture 2, the key passage and the main point is that time is real. I won't read it to you, but I will pull out the key, I think, the key sentence. The abiding truth about time is that every moment of it flies. Time, then, has a sort of abiding reality. Does anybody here ever read Whitehead? This is exactly what Whitehead says. Much later, he says exactly this. Isn't it interesting? The abidingness of time. Yeah. So this is, I was excited when I read this because I'm a Whitehead scholar. And to see that the abiding truth about that. So time abides, God abides, fast falls the eventide. This was Whitehead's favorite hymn. So he says that nature makes every present moment fleeting. Thus, I can tell what I mean about the passing and vanishing of present reality only by taking note of a certain abiding and eternal truth about the nature of time. This is the same as the passage I read you from his mother's theology. It's exactly the same idea. So it is true that this temporalization of the human experience of God, which belongs to theistic finitism, this temporalization is definitely Royce's work, but it's actually Royce's mother's work as much as it is his, because she clearly has and taught her son. He says in his autobiographical writings that his understanding, not only of the Bible, but of theology, comes from his mother. His father was a lot more conservative and was not an intellectual. And so for this reason, he also learned what you might call the standard dogmas of both Candlelight and other forms of evangelical Christianity. His father was a good man, but he was, and he loved discourse on theology. But whether he had anything to say, there's nobody who's willing to attest that he did. So, but maybe, I mean, you know, I didn't talk to him. So this is the key passage, and it has to do with time. Is time the same as nature? No, but nature is time. There's more in time than nature because moral time exists as well. All right. So, third move in the argument. It turns out that God has to deal with choice. God is temporal. And Royce has a fully developed theory of attention in chapters 9 and 10 of the religious aspect of philosophy. It's 5 years before William James published the same theory of attention in the Principles of Psychology. It's exactly the same theory. It's Royce's theory. It's not James's. However, they probably developed it together in conversation. Royce definitely beat it to publication by 5 years. So this theory of attention, it doesn't just apply to humans who have to decide within the sort of field of conscious awareness what to attend to. It applies to God. God is a personal being for Royce. And so God is a special personal being who cannot lack anything that counts knowledge. The possibilities that God attends to are the genuine possibilities. The possibilities God does not attend to are bare possibilities. They are mere abstractions to us and can make no difference to us. So all of a sudden, the argument begins to turn on which possibilities God attends to and which ones God dismisses or ignores. He is not saying that God's experience is partial. He's saying God's experience is self-sufficient and complete because the genuine possibilities are the ones that God attends to. Now, these are not Leibniz's striving possibles, but he will admit that, that God's world is the best of all possible worlds. However, it is not fulfilled as the best possible world. And so it turns out that possibilities are included in the genuine possibilities, even when we don't know and can't make sense of them, but God can. And so the whole argument that now follows from this is going to depend on this distinction between genuine possibility and bare possibility. I will inform you in advance that I don't buy it. But what I will say is that one ought to get it right. And having gotten it right, then decide whether the kinds of weaknesses that I find in it are, they are not the standard problems with theodicy. The problems with Royce's explanation of evil, with his account of evil, are new problems that nobody else has until you get to theistic finitists, and they all have these problems. But unlike other theistic finitists, Royce doesn't deny the power, the knowledge, or the goodness of God at all. He doesn't give up any one of them. So normally, if you're going to give a theodicy, you end up having to give up one of those three. Right? Either God can't do anything about it, God doesn't know about it. That's an easy one to give up. It feels cheap. But it's like, yeah, there's evil, but God doesn't actually attend to it. But Royce doesn't give up that. The normal theistic finitist move is to say that God can't do anything about it. But that's not Royce's. All right. Now, very quickly, there are three kinds of logic for Kant. Assertoric is the relation of the actual to the actual. Problematic, which includes dialectical logic, is the relation of the actual to the possible. And hypothetical is the relation of the possible to the actual. This theodicy is hypothetical. It reasons from what's possible to what's actual. The possibility involved is the genuine possibility that comes from God's attending to it. Therefore, there are three kinds of necessity in Kant as well, depending on whether you're talking the relation of the actual to the actual. That's going to be the causal order of nature. The actual to the possible, that's going to be practical reason, or the possible to the actual. And you only find that form of reasoning in the third critique under the domain of hypothetical, at least as it applies to God. He uses hypothetical reasoning in many other places, but as relates to God, this is the difference between physico and ethico theology in the natural teleology portion of the third critique. The argument is that you can argue ethico-theologically if you do it hypothetically. So if you want to go back and reread that, I think it's section 83 or 84 of the third critique. It might look new to you now, but arguing from the possible to the actual is something that Kant would do, and it doesn't because it is reflective in the form of judgment that determines it is reflective judgment. It doesn't lead you into antinomies that can't be resolved. There's only one antinomy, I think, the antinomy it takes in the third critique. And so anyway, just to remind you, but that is why logic that was created after the Graham lectures is completely irrelevant to understanding Royce. The logic he was working with, and it's very well developed in his work, is a kind of logic that went out of fashion in about 1911, when Principia Mathematica was published. Something I'm sure Whitehead lived to regret. All right, so here's the first movement of the argument. This I am going to have to read. The common mistake, even among close readers of Royce, is to assume that he is reasoning from the actual experience that is mine as an individual, claiming that it must be partial and arguing via actualist, that is assertoric necessity, that it must be someone else's experience. And of course, that's going to be the overall experience, or all experience is sort of the ultimate thing that he arrives at. This is not Royce's argument to the absolute. It never was his argument to the absolute. Anybody who reads his argument that way has not understood it at all. It's not an assertoric argument. I have a 60-page chapter in one of the more recent Royce books showing in detail how the logic of this works. I'm just summarizing it here. So it never was. He starts with a hypothesized, and this is going to happen fast, but we can slow down and talk about it if you want to. The hypothesized falsity. So it's not hypothesized truth. It's hypothesized falsity of the corresponding O counterpart. And so this is the way it goes. Suppose this: it is false that some experience is not mine. It's a false O proposition. As you're aware from subcontrariety, the corresponding I proposition has to be true, because in subcontraries they cannot both be false, but they can both be true. Suppose by hypothesis that it's false, that some experience is not mine. So the question is what does the falsity of an O proposition imply? Think of your square of opposition, the hypothetical truth of the A that is contradictory. So the A has to be hypothetically true if the O is hypothetically false. And that means all experience is someone's. And so what happened, and that includes me. So what has happened here is that we leave the predicate, some experience is not mine, undistributed in the A form, all experience is someone's. Right? But remember that that predicate was distributed in the O proposition. Not mine is a distributed proposition with a complement class, which would include everything that is mine, right? So you've got a distribution, an interesting distribution of not mine and its complement, which is then softened in the A proposition so that is someone's becomes the appropriate way to express all experience is someone's. This is the way he argues. He did it over and over. He did it 100 times, and yet nobody seems to get this. You can find this argument repeated so many times. Anyway, so all experience is someone's, and that includes me, so it's an inclusive, non-distributed predicate in the A form. And here we leave the predicate undistributed as the A form requires. We then get the problem of whether the plurality of finite individuals, which is included in that A predicate, is the same as the meaning of all in the quantifier and subject term, all experience. So we have a very interesting pluralization problem of the subject. Whose experience are we talking about? Second movement of the argument. This is where the logic of the argument is affected by the peculiarity of both propositions in which the predicate term is distributed, but only by negation and complement is not mine, which means that there is experience that is mine, and it's separate. So while the subject term is undistributed, some experience, right? Usually, but not in this case. In this case, the predicate term mine is a non-proper singular because I'm the speaker. Believe me, a lot of 20th century philosophy of language was put into utter anguish over this very thing. Every time I say, whether it's Heidegger's Gegenmeinigkeit or whether it's the problem with proper nouns and Kripke, with proper names, and you know, it begins with Russell and sort of begins with Kripke frame, everybody has been tortured by this, but Royce is not tortured. Part of it is that he has three forms of necessity to draw on instead of just one. He says, so as a non-proper singular, it's always and only refers to a single person, which is the speaker, and so functions like a proper name, but this is the predicate, remember, which, as everyone knows, is distributed as an affirmative universal. So because this thing is sitting there in the predicate in an O proposition, it has an effect on the subject term experience, rendering it a singular universal. That's weird, but that's how O propositions work, and that's why they're so darned interesting. All right, so now the question is, all right, who is this mine and what is this O proposition? And so it turns out that what happens when we look at the A contradictory of it, and remember this is all just a hypothesis, is that all experience means identity in a special sense, and the special sense is part to whole, which is my experience is part of a greater experience, which is the true A proposition that follows from the hypothesized falsity of the O proposition. Now we get to the key passage. This is in the Graham lectures, and it is not anywhere else. So I just gave you an argument that was repeated many, many times in Royce's corpus, but this is in the 5th lecture, and it is incredibly complex. And it's also published in the Problem of Job, but people didn't understand it. You are truly one with God, part of his life. When you suffer, your sufferings are God's sufferings. He's drawing on the kind of identity that I just explained. In the full paper, there's a much longer account of how he gets to this identity from an analogy. That the two Christians have had for a longer time, but they only had this for 2 days. So I hope that going through it will help them as well, because this is really tough. But pardon, not his external work, not his your sufferings, not his external work, not his penalty, not the fruit of neglect. Look at that series of nots. One of the things that's great about no propositions is, so the name of that 60-page paper I referred to is Complex Negation and Logical Magic. I identify 6 different levels of negation in this argument, and they all have different functions, and they draw different kinds of necessity. When you're arguing hypothetically, you can put into your hypothetical argument dialectical arguments and assertorial arguments, as long as it's discharged at the end. And so there's all these levels of negation. It says, but it's identically his own personal woe. In you, God suffers precisely as you do, and has all your concern in overcoming this grief. The true question is then, why does God suffer? This refocuses the entire question. And he says the sole, possible, necessary, and sufficient answer is, that's about as emphatic, logically speaking, as you can get. And in the full paper, I go through each one of these terms and explain what it means in Latin argument. The answer is because without suffering, take away suffering. Without ill, take away ill. Without woe, evil, tragedy, God's life could not be perfected. It's a hypothetical argument. And the question is whether God can do what God sets out to do. And the answer is yes. But the form of the answer is a complex negation, about 6. And actually, I suggest in that article I'm talking about, there's 2 more possible levels of negation, depending on how you interpret this. So possibly as many as 8 different negation functions are involved in this assertion. It is no simplistic solution to the problem of evil. The logical form of this is quite subtle. All right, so it could not be perfected. He's not saying it will be. He's saying you have to think of it this way. You really have no choice, and it's the sole, possible, necessary, and sufficient answer. It is absolutely normative for your thinking that you think about it this way. Otherwise, you're going to be confused. All right, it is a logical argument. I'm not going to go through this, but you see all the yellow. Right. The yellow shows the part-whole relationship that I was just describing to you in that hypothetically true A proposition. So the grief is not, it's not this, it's not that, but it is logically necessary. Logically necessary, no is a universal quantifier and the E proposition there, thus alone. So there's no other path to the completeness. And so, as you can see, God in his wholeness, in order for God to be conceived as whole, you must conceive your own suffering as being fully included. Now just pause for a second and use your common sense. You got 2 choices when it comes to your own suffering. Either it has nothing to do with God or it has everything to do with God. If you say that it has nothing to do with God, you must be very smart, because you would have to know everything that does have to do with God in order to know that your suffering has nothing to do with God. Therefore, logically, it's only logical. It's not an ontological argument. This is just the logic. In order to think logically about this, and remember, reason is the final appeal for this theodicy. In order to think logically about this, you just have to admit that God suffers your suffering. Turns out that works really well if you're a Christian, since Jesus suffered. And you're going to have to decide whether Jesus is or isn't God in some sense. Interesting. So, God is not the absolute. This passage, which I won't read to you, essentially gives the distinction in Royce's thinking between the absolute, which is a metaphysical elaboration of the ethical God, and God, which is God. The metaphysics is secondary for Royce. It's an elaboration of ethics. It is not the foundation of ethics. Ethics is the foundation of metaphysics. I wrote a whole book about this, and so did Dwayne Tunstall. So if you're going to read Royce rightly, you have to understand ethics as first philosophy for him. Metaphysics is not very important. Ethics is important. So in this, he says what I just said. He says, all right, let's move to theistic finitism. We're almost done. If you're familiar with the 20th century discussion of theistic finitism, then you might know Hick, or you might know Tillich, or you might, if you're a personalist, you might know Edgar Brightman, or you might know Hartshorne, or some other process theologians who have given some version or another of theistic finitism. Not one of them argues from the possibility of God's completing the ideal experience to the meaning of finite suffering. Now, the arguments of each one of these, and I'm happy to talk about any one of them you want, the arguments of each one of these has interesting insights and interesting moves, but I actually think that they all end up giving up something of orthodoxy. Whereas I'm not sure that Royce does. I'm not sure that Royce is an unorthodox, in any sense, Protestant Christian. I think he might be fully orthodox. And that's a rare thing in modern thought. Part of what makes him, a candidate for being an Orthodox Christian, I mean, he didn't go to church and didn't recognize the church as being legitimate at all. But part of what makes him a candidate for Orthodox theology, and by this I don't mean the Eastern Orthodox Church, I'm just talking about holding to essentially everything you have to in order to be recognized as professing Christianity. And so he doesn't toss away any of it the way that most modern theologians do. They'll pick and choose. But he doesn't, he actually corrects the sort of New Testament centrism of Candlelight theology by going back to the God of Israel who spoke to the prophets as being sort of the source of ethical monotheism. In his book, The Problem of Christianity, he articulates this ethical monotheism in a completely ecumenical way, which is to say that you don't have to be Abrahamic at all. You don't have to belong to the Western religions at all to belong to the kind of ethical monotheism that he is talking about. And so any Eastern viewpoint, any sort of indigenous religion should still be able to function under the theological, well, it's actually a philosophy of religion. It's not really theological in Problem of Christianity. That's a very delicate distinction, which I haven't bothered to make, but trust me, it's delicate. It can be done, though. And so anyway, by the time he wrote The Problem of Christianity, which was 1913, it's about 15 years after this, actually 17 years after this. By the time he wrote that, he had really worked out what to do with the standard tropes of Christianity, like original sin, the invisible church, the communion of saints. He's got all of this in The Problem of Christianity, but in a completely ecumenical form. However, I think that the persuasiveness of that argument depends on this argument, theologically. That if you don't have this argument, you'll go, he's making all this up. He isn't making it up. He's adapting Candlelight theology to this kind of insight, this kind of part-whole argument. And so the more you study his logic, the more sense this makes. But he says, you don't need a metaphysics. All you need is some experience of your own and this logic. And that's all you need. You don't need to be an idealist. You don't need to be a philosopher. All you have to do is recognize that it's just as simple as saying that if God's experience doesn't, say it negatively, because that's the right way to do it for Royce. If God's experience doesn't include my suffering, then there is no God. Because my suffering is real. If God's suffering does include my experience, then God is temporal. So, I'm sorry, but the Thomistic metaphysics just went out the window. God has a real relation to the universe, and it is you. So, there we go. I think that's what I have to say.
Well, thank you so much. You see, I didn't promise too much. We are enjoying our conversation. But Christoph, you start, and then it's Christian, and please feel free to raise your virtual hands or your real hands, and I'm greatly looking forward to our exchange. Please.
Randy, thank you so much for this lecture. And the things you said, I didn't know the influence of his mother.
That's a different paper. I can send you the paper. It's a different paper. Sorry, I didn't send you that.
So I start by just summarizing what I understood.
All right.
And then formulating two questions. As I understood your paper and your lecture, one of its main theses may be formulated for me as follows. Royce does not make a strong existential claim concerning his discussion of the problem of yoke, at least not primarily, but he does make a very strong logical claim.
Yeah.
And against this background, your approach to Royce referred to Kant. Let me just mention one aspect of the things which I find interesting. You do not so much refer to the qualitative dimensions of the factual side of religious life processes, like James, etc., but your focus rather is in your interpretation of Royce on the somehow contrafactual question of how we necessarily should intellectually understand the conception of God, of how we should think about God. Royce's approach to this question is interesting. First of all, one has to explore the meaning of concept with which we are prima vista most familiar, that is the concept of reality. That is the beginning of the second lecture. Yeah. The intellectual content of the conception of God is thus developed by developing the concept of reality. Both go together, God as realissimum, question mark. Now, one of the clues I see in your interpretation is that we only might find our different kinds of experiences to be meaningful if we conceive them as parts relating to a whole. A whole, and this is a decisive point, of which we can have no experience at all, but which we have logically to presuppose in order to comprehend our experiences as meaningful, whether they are experiences of error or failure, or of consummation or success. This procedure of thinking is introduced following Kant's differentiation of judgments and hypothetical thinking, as thinking from possibility to actuality, that is, from the conceived possibility of the whole to the actuality of its parts. And because of this reflective relation between parts and wholes, one finally can say that what is actual for me, failure, error, success, happiness, etc., is actual for God as well. The converse is not valid, since the possibility of the whole are not to be identified with the actuality of its parts. It follows that to deal with the question of meaning thoroughly, we need to think of ourselves as if we were parts of an including whole. If we are parts, we don't know. Correct. In Royce's words quoted by you, what you experience, God experiences. The difference lies only in this, that God sees in unity what you see in fragments. So the idea of finitude is expressed in terms of this part-whole relation. That's all. This is for me very briefly one of the core elements, or perhaps even the core element of Royce's argument as it is shown in your paper. If I follow its basic outlines, I find no contradiction. It seems consistent and is presented with the claim of being able to integrate the diversity of phenomena within itself on intellectual grounds. This is compelling, maybe even more compelling, as William James' pretty associative way of thinking. So much for the affirmative side. Now comes the but. Two questions. One question I cancel because it touches something you didn't mention in your lecture, but only in the paper.
Well, you can ask it, maybe I'll summarize.
First, actually, this is a formal question, the first one. Maybe I didn't get everything right, but I will ask it. Actually, I don't really understand the notion theistic finitism. Why do I understand it? Why do I have trouble to understand this notion theistic finitism? I don't understand how it is possible to apply the predicate finite to God if God means the all-encompassing ideal system of experience from which we are parts. In order to apply finite to God, one would have to be able to take a standpoint beyond this ideal system of experience, the whole, which would be nonsense. Maybe I missed something, but one could say neither God is infinite nor God is finite without an additional preposition. I hope you get the problem.
Sure.
I cannot make sense of this finite.
I think I can help.
Attribute.
Yeah.
Okay. Formula. Second question. Now, I just dare to ask it even if you don't mention it.
Yeah.
I completely agree with you that for Royce, ethics is prima philosophia. If this is the case, and it certainly is, one might find more or less strong existential motives, or interests in Royce's argument. But at the same time, you sharply reject, at least in your paper, such interpretation.
As whining. I call it whining.
Why the battle against the so-called existentialists with their focus on pre-philosophical and pre-scientific experience? I mention this because Royce could be interpreted maybe as a very ambitious reader of experience. So the second question, my last final remark. If I follow the thesis that ethics is prima philosophia, I might conclude that individual needs, experiences, and actions make a difference. So that's Royce, perhaps. They cannot, at least, under certain conditions, they can't, at least under certain conditions. Even religious experiences of the wild kind, like James' religious experiences, may count. Against this backdrop, I wonder how Royce's conception of God may be referred to them. Now comes the end. Let me look through my notes. Let me refer to the beginning to make this clear. At the end of the first Graham lecture, we saw this at the PowerPoint. Royce summarizes his thesis. We already saw it. He writes, God and man touch hands. God and man touch hands. And I'm well aware that this is metaphorical speech, not to be taken literally. But what does it mean, God and man touch hands, in this philosophical conception or theological conception? According to my understanding, which might go wrong, I touch the hand of God, the whole with all its parts, when I touch the hand of my fellow, of my neighbors. That's all. Or is there more to say about it? Royce God seems to, at least in the Graham lectures, a more or less intellectual ideal, a philosophical vision, concept. How does it relate to the wild religious experiences of man?
Thank you. I think I can answer that quickly, Stefan. Yeah, your answer. Okay, so I think I can actually. So your third question is actually just the existential version of your first question.
Yeah.
Trying to understand what theistic finitism means. The label theistic finitism, of course, came along much later, 1930s. I think that Brightman and Hartshorn in the book I edited were using the term in the 30s to describe what they, and so they were having the finite infinite God arguments. And so I recommend that book that I edited of their correspondence, because it's about as fascinating an exchange on what on earth finite could mean as applied to God and what infinite could mean as applied to us. It's about as good a discussion as you're ever going to find. Those guys were smart. But for Royce, I mean, their concern is completely different from Royce's. The theistic finitism means he's a theist and that God includes the finite as a part of his life, or as God's life, the divine life. He actually doesn't, he does refer to God as a he regularly. But when it comes to this point, he always says the divine life. God includes the finite as part of the divine life. And so there's the theistic finitism means that everything finite is included in this case, but that's not what it normally means. What it normally means is that there are modalities of finitude that are inherent to God's form of existing. That's certainly what Brightman says. And Brightman is the one who gives us Martin Luther King's God. And so it's important, you know, to look at for King's first 5 years as an activist, he's working with Brightman's conception of God. He did overcome it. But anyway, so this is a very important conception of finitude in God. And it also touches on the existentialism question, because my problem with existentialism is that the kind of existentialism that has been associated with Royce is nothing but James. James was a terrible reader of Royce. He's not reliable on any point, and he knew it himself and said so. But people who like James, I like James, by the way, a lot. But people who like James have a tendency to try to make James into the solution to problems that James is not the solution for. And so it's that kind of existentialism. I mean, so what they do is they whine in Jamesian fashion. And if there's one thing I can't stand about James, it's that he whines all the time. He is the whiniest philosopher in the history of philosophy. He's always, oh, poor me. And the other side of that is his manly Harvard, bravado that he puts on in a lot of what he writes. But everybody knows that underneath he sees himself as a puny, weak, absolutely unworthy being who, and so a lot of philosophers will glom on to James because they feel that way. It's a common thing, especially in the current situation. And in no way am I criticizing that because, I get that. It's not me. But I think, life's tough. Sometimes some folks really do need that sort of existential therapy in order to just get through it. I don't happen to be one of those people, but that doesn't mean that I'm minimizing. I think my temperament is much closer to Royce's, which is get over it. Everybody's suffering. Everybody's suffering. Get over it. And so that's Royce. So did Royce suffer? Yes. As much as any philosopher I could point to, he suffered. His view, get over it. so anyway, but he knew that was just a temperamental thing. He knew that it was sort of his, it's not exactly a gift, it's as much a curse as it is a gift, because it renders you seemingly insensitive to very important human things. And Royce was insensitive to very important human things. And that's in spite of the fact that he had experienced pretty much the worst of it himself, personally. His temperament is, he's stoical, not in the sense of philosophical stoicism, but the soft underneath that comes out in Oppenheim's writings about his nervous breakdowns and the soft underbelly, if you will. It's real and it's there. And he was doing a balancing act existentially, but his attitude toward it was always stoical. Get over it. And so anyway, I don't think he's insensitive to this, but I think he seems insensitive. But here's the thing. If you start with this soft underbelly and you try to understand Royce, you're going to miss everything I just gave you. Because it's hard work to understand what he takes himself really to be arguing. These arguments are not simple, and you got to work very hard in order to put them in the order that he puts them in. He does his best to communicate them, but they're tough. And so you spend the time and you say, oh, I see. This is the way the argument works. It's hypothetical. It's with 6 levels of negation. It's hypothetical, and he's not saying that God exists this way. He's saying you have to think he does. Otherwise, you're in trouble. All right, so that's my answer to your question. And by the way, you got the argument right. So,
oh my God. Thanks, Randall, for the presentation. So, what should I add? These are more spontaneous remarks, even though I read your papers twice. I hope I got a hint of the argument. I must confess, yes, I am a theistic finitist. And I would say, you can say, you can call God finite, not in the Jamesian sense, at the end of the pluralistic universe, but in a logical sense. If that's the point, and I would also subscribe that James got the right idea, but the bad philosophy to explain and conceptualize his insight. So that's my first point. The second is I'm a personalist too. This part of your paper you switched out, so I don't get into these details. I start also with some confirmations or affirmations as a theologian. I think the distinction between existential finitude and logical finitude really necessary when one gets to the point that how to deal with the problem of theodicy, not of evil, which is a slightly different thing, but with the problem of theodicy, that I find this distinction is very helpful. I also agree with your reading of Royce that Royce's sympathy with what he later calls in the problems, especially the Christian theory of life, has to do with the fact that God is one who suffers not with, but in us. But that is not a simple mysticism, and as we can see in parts of the modern contemporary theology. And it's not the same like the locus classicus of Reformation theology, which goes back to Luther and his Theologia Crucis. And I think Royce has a point, which he also elaborates in his crucial essay, What is Vital in Christianity, that the point of Christianity, which makes it really interesting, which maybe goes back to the problem of Job, but not with the solution in the book of Job, is this idea that God is only God when you can say he suffers in us, because that's the point to stress that evil is not an illusion or something which goes back to a karma situation, but is real in its individuality and in its singularity for each person, so to say. The third point I want to make is, and this I find very interesting, is that one can really not understand the argumentation and the famous essay, The Problem of God, if one neglects that it is the 5th of 5 lectures in a series, and which is linked especially to the 4th lecture, which is interesting enough because I think Royce's point is one completely misunderstood or misconceptualized the question of theodicy if one tried to figure out if in the order of nature there is some specific manifestation of God's purpose or something like that. So in that sense, Royce is also interesting to say, yes, evolution may be part of God's role and it is a hint of his purpose, but you cannot combine evolutionary theory with some kind of intelligent design theory or the complete other thing. But the crucial thing is, let's say, the role of moral subjects called persons, and God maybe is also. It's not 2, 3, or 4 questions I have. The one is, you just mentioned it once in your presentation now, is the difference between the concept, the metaphysical concept of the absolute, which is also crucial for Royce's work, even though his prima philosophia is, I agree with you, ethics, and the conception of God. And I would like to ask you if you could clarify the status or the difference between concept and conception. Yeah, because someone like Hilary Putnam would use it just the other way around, to say the concept is something is worked out in our life, and then it would be the concept of God, following your interpretation of Royce and his interpretation of the problem of God, not the other way around. And that has to do with another question. Is there a link, or how to link logic and ontology, metaphysics and theology, even though we all agree that the primacy is on logic in the kind of theological way, and on ethics regarding to metaphysics, which is only an elaboration for people who are, like Royce, very sophisticated in their intellectual mass, so to say. So if you could say a little bit more to that, this would be interesting. The next part of my questions is how you would read the very late dealing of Royce, especially in the metaphysics lecture of 1916, I think, edited by Hocking, how to deal metaphysically with the problem of disorder, dysteleology, of the problem of death, so it is called in their late lectures. And the reason why I add this here is, this seems to me a hint that you have to try to figure out how Royce connects logic with metaphysics, and so metaphysics and with ontology. So how far does this distinction go, and where is the link? Maybe the last question goes to something you now just add. And God is temporal and eternal, as far as I understood Royce. But the question asks, what is eternal and what is temporal? Especially when it comes to the problem, or better, the reality of evil in God and man. And is there a kind of monistic strand still in the later Royce, or in the Royce as you reconstructed him? Because monism is always saying, yes, time is a kind of subsidiary or kind of negative, illusionary form of eternity. But that couldn't be true if we follow your Royce interpretation. So is there a kind of eternity of my personal evil in God's eternity, though it is temporal? You see the point? From the point of a systematic theologian, it's the question how to link the problem of evil, the problem of theodicy, with the question of eschatology. And so if you have there some ideas, I would really like to hear it from you, because you're one of the best Royce scholars I met, and there are, thankfully, in the last 2 decades, getting more of Royce scholars beyond the globe. So thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Christian. So you'll probably have to remind me of that first question again. Let me tackle the last two while I have them in my mind. The relationship. So everything you asked is answered in some detail in that book, Time, Will, and Purpose. And they all require quite long answers and close answers that are textual in order to, but I will summarize them here, and you can actually go find the texts in Royce by looking at my arguments. So the connection between logic and ontology, I spend a tremendous amount of energy on in that book. But the fast version is take a look at chapters 5 and 6, And you'll see that the way I handle the massive amount of things that Royce says about the connection of logic and ontology is by introducing a vocabulary of act, actuality, action, and activity. These are different levels of generality that, and he really does analyze things differently. When, so act is in the beginning, in Anfang war der Tat, and then the devil appears, right? So it's like, you gotta be careful, but you know that all process philosophers and theologians are going to say in the beginning was the act, and Royce is definitely one of them. And so, and now the question is, what is the act? Right, so you get one story from Bob Neville and another story from Charles Hartson. But Royce's story is the act is the ethical act. In the beginning is the ethical act. Now, is the ethical act one or many? Yes. The answer to that question is yes. It's one and it's many. The formula he came up with, and he was formulating it in the Graham lectures, is to be uniquely related to a whole. To be is to be uniquely related to a whole. There's your, I mean, so what for Whitehead, the many become one and are increased by one. For Royce, to be is to be uniquely related to a whole. This theory of uniquity or uniquification or uniquifaction is something he takes from Schelling. You can find him sort of pulling it out of Schelling in the lectures on modern idealism, which were published after he died. And so it's clear that he became really interested in individuality as sort of a manifestation of the relation of sui generis. I mean, it's a relation, it's not a thing. And so if it were a thing, it would be unintelligible. But as a relation, it's only partly unintelligible. And as a general rule, the unintelligible part of your uniqueness is your unintelligibility to yourself. And your primary action, actuality, and activity is that of interpretation. So now I'm to the late Royce stuff that you're talking about. As he developed this, as he was working with our unintelligibility to ourselves and understanding that others understand us better than we understand ourselves, which is basic to Royce. The only way I get access to myself is from others. And so to go back to what Christoph said, that yes, when I touch the other, I touch God. The question is whether I can succeed in touching myself and in the same way. The mediation of the other is primary in this case. And then the question is well, is there a mediator of the mediations? And the answer to that question is yes. So there's a relation of all relations. Getting at it is not all that easy. So metaphysically speaking, God is a word that we use in order to sort of encapsulate the relator of all relations. And this is an argument I've had with Bob Neville a number of times. But true, yeah.
I mean, the sympathetic position of you and Royce, and I think myself too, as written in the book Expressive Theism, is we are starting in the middle. And that is why we can go this way. The point Bob, Neville, and others have, and which is also a problem for a theologian, for the question of evil, is there any kind of theory of creation, which we ex nihilo, or the one was first and there was nothing else. So this is something one can hardly combine with these kind of Roycean thinking.
You can't.
Yeah.
That's why I argue with it.
Yeah. And
if you read his essay in your new book, I completely disagree with it. So, I mean, what am I going to say? I mean, it's not like Bob's not smart. So.
Yeah, but then, of course, the problem of evil or the problem of theology, as one has to try to figure it out from a theological background, is not sufficiently dealt with if one cannot link creation or what we call creator, that is also pointed versus philosophy, I think, the ex nihilo thing, with the fact that it's real evil here. So the suffering model, which Royce offers us, is fine, and I think it's the best solution, if there is any solution we have. But the problem still remains with the question, how to deal with the Creator, and that is from the history of theology or Christian thinking, the crucial thing, because this is the Gnostic danger theology ever had. So the Creator and the Redeemer and how to bring it. And that, in this sense, I think Royce isn't interested in that. Because
oh, wrong.
Wrong?
Yeah.
So that's how it.
Yeah, I will. So there are 3 paragraphs that I put in for Stefan that you haven't read yet that are now in the last version that I sent to you that are specifically about this. I call them the Jesus paragraphs because, in fact, I think he is very much interested in this. He's not interested in Jesus as a historical being. But think about it this way. It actually, so you asked me about the death thing. What Royce explicitly says, and it has led a lot of people to scratch their heads, is that I die when God doesn't need me anymore. That's what he says. That's what death is. I die when God doesn't need me anymore. It's one of the strangest things anyone ever said, I think. But when you think about what you're talking about, how that God suffers in us, not just with us, that God suffers in us. Remember that series of withouts that I read from the Graham lectures? Without me, including my suffering and ill and woe and tragedy, the whole list, without that, the divine life cannot be perfected. And so that means God needs me. And so you can see that a lot of process philosophers are going to like that I'm a co-creator with God, and he's saying so. It just turns out that all creation is also destruction. It's the destruction of possibilities. It's the destruction of genuine possibilities that never will be because of the ones that I willed. And he uses that word of my will in the Graham lectures. It takes me about 100 pages to explain Royce's theory of the will, partly because it looks a lot like Schopenhauer until you start studying it. And then you begin to realize that Schopenhauer was the problem and Royce's theory is the answer to that. I mean, he struggled with Schopenhauer so badly that it nearly cost him his mental health. And so, in fact, it did cost him his mental health. And he's not the only one who has ever struggled with Schopenhauer in that way. And so he brought Schopenhauer back from Leipzig. It must have been, it couldn't have been Göttingen, because at Göttingen, people are nice. And he could not break this is one thing Cade says in his article on Royce could not break the whole Schopenhauer.
Thanks to God that he remembered that he studied with Lotze.
Yeah. That's true.
Anyway.
Well, Lotze has a Kantian will, and Schopenhauer has a Kantian will. It's just that Schopenhauer's version of the will is the thing itself. and so it's like that once you make that move, all of a sudden you begin to realize that finitude and meaninglessness are the only thing that can possibly follow. My will has to be something. And so Royce's solution, and I spent a lot of time on this in the Time, Will, and Purpose book, will is the second word, the solution is a very original and creative solution, which is to say, I have no individual will except as the residuum of my action. So it's not, this is not a causal will. This is what we call will, means what I have in fact done. And it exists in the hell of the irrevocable, just like everything else I have ever done. And so sometimes it's a hell and sometimes it's a heaven, is the point. But God can use all of it, is the point. And so in the beginning was the act. The act is irrevocable because God and I are temporal. You can't undo it. Even God can't undo it, because then God would remember undoing it, would remember the way things were. So you don't have to give up omnipotence or anything like that to say that God can't undo what has once been done. But you do have to say what it means for the divine life to be temporal. And that is really, really challenging. Time is the first word. And that Royce's theory of time is really subtle and it is original. Nobody else has it. And not many people have managed to sort of wrap their heads around this theory of time. I would say the best clue to getting Royce's theory of time right, because he rejects Augustine, he rejects Aquinas and Aristotle. Time is not the measure of motion, and it isn't even Augustine. His theory of time has to do with looking at the present as overlapping time spans, hierarchies of time spans. And the present is, of course, a moving target, but it comes down to act and actuality, what he calls the world of facts. And so whatever that world is, that's what we're going to treat as the present. So simultaneity is then the definition of space, and there isn't any real space for, he says this in the Graham lectures, space is phenomenal. It's an appearance, but it is created by us in our action. So human action and action of any kind is capable of creating spaces. And that's what God does as God acts, and God acts in and through us. And so therefore, we are co-creators with God, and the process theologians get what they want. So
if you want to use the opportunity of asking Randy questions on Royce, use it now, or also other people who accompany us on Zoom. And just
use the hand raise function.
Yeah, use it. But I actually have a very simple question, but you threw out all those names. I mean,
at the end.
Yeah, not only at the end, it's
a pile of theologians.
It was most kind of you to refer to what Royce might have, and it might have an interest in Jesus, and was this domestic metaphysics. But
I forgot to give you the Jesus-y thing.
Well, yeah, okay, go on.
So, in Problem of Christianity, and Royce has taken a lot of, and Christian brought this up, has taken a lot of heat for making the Christian life and the Christian community exceptional. I mean, he's very clear in the Problem of Christianity that this, even though it's historical, and normally history wouldn't matter in theology or in the philosophy of religion, both of which are included in that book, which is mostly philosophy of religion. Normally history wouldn't matter, but in this case, something changed in human history in the Christ event. And so everybody's now going to roll their eyes and say, oh, here it comes. It's just as I suspected. It's another apology for Christianity. I thought I was reading philosophy and I was reading apologetics instead. That's the way a lot of people reacted when it comes to that moment in the Problem of Christianity. That's because they aren't seeing how that actually works. It's not Jesus who died for you. It's everybody. It's not everybody who has died, but everyone who will. Your salvation comes from other finite interpretation. That's what it means to have a beloved community. So the beloved community is his concept, by golly, even though the words were used before Royce, and I have a little article on that. The words were used before Royce, but the version of the beloved community that Martin Luther King takes up and that the 20th century theologians take up, this idea of the beloved community is we all die for each other. We also live for each other. And so is there death in God? Yes, there is. I went ahead and wrote that one up as the final chapter of my Whitehead book, which is called God's Mortal Soul. And I'm taking on Hartshorne and Neville in that one, because what it means for there to be death in God is something Hartshorne really struggled with. And Bob has a beautiful answer for it as well, but it's not the same as Royce's answer, and it's not the same as mine. For there to be death in God really does come down to God doesn't need me anymore. And Hartshorne almost says that in a couple of places. One of the places, I remember in an interview that I did with him on television, which is also in the back of that Hartshorne Brightman book, I asked him, what are you going to do with the fact that wicked people live, they get you know, they get rich, they, you know, and they never get punished. And your God isn't going to punish them, right? That's not going to happen. And he went, can I imitate Hartshorn? Is that right? In a way, the wicked get what they want. But who wants what they want? And so, and that's the answer, man. That's because if you think about it, it's like, there must be, he didn't say this because he was a kind man, there must be something in you that wants what the wicked are getting, and maybe even the way they're getting it, or this wouldn't bother you. And so it's a little bit better to get over it. Because it brings it down to that existential level and says, why is this bothering you? Yeah, they might get what they want, but do you really want what the wicked want? I mean, think about it. Surely not. Would you want to be Trump? Is that man happy? I don't. For you can have, you know, an entire heaven of Mar-a-Lagos, and I don't want to be that guy. Because there is a problem inherent in the man's relation to the divine life. And he's not doing anything about it.
And the religious answer or the religious problem reconstructed by that is not, do you have something which you really want like the wicked have? But the problem of evil is the problem of the suffering of others. And that's the question. That's a complete inversion of how to redirect your attitude and to reconstruct the problem also in a philosophical way. So this might be an...
Well, this will take us too far afield, but I agree with you that Royce has to answer this problem. I also believe he has an answer. His answer, the fast version, the beloved community is actual right now. It's just underdetermined. So he has this theory of the determination of the beloved community that has to do with the alignment of our wills with the ideal of the divine life. It's something you are free to do right now, and so am I. And if we all do it, what we'll discover is that the ideal life already exists.
Yeah,
and it's fully actual, we just don't want it.
I totally agree. Royce has an answer. Armstrong didn't have an answer.
No, he didn't.
Bob didn't have it too.
No. Well, almost nobody gets this beloved idea, beloved community idea right, because in order to get it, I mean, so generally speaking, I disagree with John E. Smith's reading of Royce, but not this part. He has a better explanation of the actual infinite than Royce has. He not only gets Royce right, but he makes Royce clear. And so the question is, what does it mean for something to be wholly determinate and yet and wholly actual? I mean, wholly actual, but not wholly determinate. And he's not just making the perspectival argument that it's wholly determinate and wholly actual from God's point of view, but not from ours. That is not his argument. That's falling back onto the bad argument that I attacked at the beginning of my paper. But what he's saying is that, as a matter of fact, it's wholly determinate as a genuine possibility for God, and God is attending to that. The trouble is we aren't. And so it turns out that the inevitability of the betrayal of the beloved community is the meaning of original sin. It happens over and over. We keep betraying the beloved community.
So, well, we got the taste of what philosophical theology might be. And for us, well, thank you so much. I think we close here and enjoy ourselves with a glass of wine and continue our debates. And when we finish our Zoom meeting, and thank you so much for coming here, for joining us, for engaging in our exchange. And thank you, Randy, for all the ideas you were presenting us, and looking forward to continue on this. If you found new interest in Josiah Royce, come back at the end of February. Then we have the Colloquium Religious Philosophy. It's dedicated to the thought of John Dewey and Josiah Royce. This das Imaginäre der Gemeinschaft, thank you, and we just start the debate of including Josiah Royce in our philosophical and theological reflections. Thank you so much to Christopher Christian as well, and have a good evening.